Hi, I'm Gabrielle Haston, and I'm the chorus teacher here at Dade County High School, and I was a junior in high school when 9/11 happened 20 years ago. It was a Tuesday morning, and I came out of my English class, which was my first period class, and we had this kid. Every school has the kid that runs around the hallways shouting stupid stuff up and down the hallways, and his name was Justin, and he was running up and down the hall going, "We're going to war, we're going to war, we're going to war," and we were all like, "Shut up, Justin, you're being an idiot," and walked on to our next class. So my second period class was choir, and when I walked into second period, my choir teacher had the television on, and I watched the second plane hit the second tower. And at that moment, I didn't know what to think at all. My first thought was, what in the world is happening? This is a terrible accident. How did a pilot fly into a plane? And the next minute, the guy on the news was saying, okay, now that it's happened twice, we think we're under attack. For the rest of the day, in every single class, we just watched the news for the next 5 periods. And then when we got home, my family just watched the news all night long. And I remember being so scared, thinking that like the government was going to reinstitute the draft and we were all going to get drafted because now we can have women in the military. So I was going to get drafted, my boyfriend was going to get drafted, all my friends were going to get drafted, and was the beginning of World War III is what I was afraid that it was. And that night, CBS News had a camera set up in some park in New York where it was just a live feed, and people would just walk in front of the camera and say, "I'm looking for my husband, his name is this is what he looks like, he was in this building on this street," and just cry because they were trying to find their loved ones. Nobody could get a hold of anybody in New York City for the next several weeks. And so it was very scary to think that this could happen. For the rest of the day, when we found out that the plane had flown into the Pentagon and then the plane had crashed in Pennsylvania, everybody was scared what the next thing was. And in this area, because we have TVA, everything locked down really tight because we were all scared that they were going to attack one of our nuclear plants or the power grid for the South. And I just remember being scared for a very, very long time afterwards. And it's interesting now, 20 years later, to see some things that changed based on that one day. Like, we now have to take our shoes off in the airport. Before that, your family could walk you straight up to the gate. And now you have to take your shoes off and go through the x-ray, and you have to be dropped off way before security. So that is my remembrance of 9/11.
My name is Stan Gibby. I'm a math teacher here at Dade County High School, and I wanted to share my remembrance of 9/11. I remember exactly where I was when I heard that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. And I know my initial thought was, well, it must be a little small passenger plane, like a little Cessna or something like that, because that had happened before. And so I was in my classroom. A teacher came to my door and said, "A plane just hit the World Trade Center." And I said, "What?" And so we scrambled very quickly. Back in those days, we didn't have projectors and Promethean boards and all of that, and we got the television on the cart up in the front of the classroom and got the cable hooked up and got it all turned on just in time to see the second plane hit the second tower. And it was surreal. I can remember just feeling totally numb about the whole thing and thinking, what does this mean for our country? What is going on? And of course, by that time, everybody's knowing that this is an act of terrorism, and so I can remember that week just being, we were totally consumed with watching what was going on in the news, and I don't think we did anything the rest of the week in any classes. I can remember every class having a television on. We had televisions at lunch, and it was just a devastating act of terrorism that our country had never experienced before. The closest was, of course, Pearl Harbor, and that day, 9/11, when it happened, later that day, I thought back to an event that had happened about 3 months prior to that. Back in June, maybe right around the 1st of June, my wife and I took our 2 daughters, who were very young at the time, and we went to New York City. And we didn't stay for an extended time. We were visiting some family in DC, and so we just drove up to New York City to spend the day and sightsee and do as many things as we could in a day. And we wanted to see the Statue of Liberty. And the Statue of Liberty, the island, Liberty Island, was closed, so we couldn't go there. But somebody suggested that we take the ferry, the Staten Island ferry, because it went right past the Statue of Liberty. So we did, and we got on the ferry and start riding over towards Staten Island, passing Lady Liberty there. And this gentleman sat down beside us, and we started a conversation, or he started a conversation with us. And we were just amazed at how friendly and nice he was. And he was telling us the things that we could do in a day, and telling us, hey, you know, I can tell you where to get Broadway tickets for the day of the show, and really cheap, and all of that. Just an extremely nice guy. And we were just amazed that people in New York City were that kind. And I never will forget, he told us, I asked him, I said, what do you do? And he said, well, I work at the World Trade Center. And on 9/11, the only thing I could think about was, I wonder if that guy was able to get out of the building before it collapsed. And I'll never forget that. I'll never forget his face, and you know, I can't remember his name, but I've often wondered since then if he survived. He struck me as the kind of person who probably would have helped others, and you know, that's probably the greatest memory I have of 9/11 is just seeing it bring out the very best in all the New Yorkers, and just in people around our nation who reached out and helped the people who were there. So that's what I remember about 9/11, and I always think about that guy on the Staten Island ferry.
I'm Jeff Scott. I'm currently serving as assistant principal here at Dade County High School, and I wanted to share my remembrance of 9/11. 9/11 to me was a huge day in my life, and every generation has those kind of days, but 9/11 really to me changed a lot. During 9/11, I was what I call a baby teacher, just beginning out, and I remember I had a student teacher that day. And one of the things, though, even before that, is that there was a lot of animosity in the country, not so much as now, being in 2021, but we just came through the Clinton impeachment trial 3 years before that. The year before, we had, or a year and a half before, during the presidential election of Bush-Gore, we had that hanging Chad situation, and there was a lot of division over that. And so it was like you just sensed we were splitting in two countries. But on 9/11, things changed in my mind on that. And so I'll get to that in just a second. But so during this time I had a student teacher, and the student teacher was teaching. It was early in the morning, it was September 11th. And I was teaching 5th grade at the time. And so there was a knock on my door, and there was a student there with a note. And again, this is before we had smartphones or anything of that nature. Now, we had cell phones, obviously, but we didn't have smartphones, and there just wasn't a lot of texting going on at that time either. And so I had a note sent over, and I opened the note up, and it says, "Are you watching TV?" And I thought this was odd. This was an odd note to be sent from a teacher beside me. I thought, why would I be watching TV? And so while the student teacher was still working with the kids and stuff, I went over to TV, and those had been in education a while. You'll remember that we had these big box square TVs on the wall. And for whatever reason, it seemed like if a school was built, it came with a big square TV on the wall. So I turned it on, and it took a minute for the screen to come up. And the first thing I see is the second plane hitting the tower. And I thought, what is going on? And then the commentator was talking about the Pentagon being hit. So I immediately turned the TV off, and I thought, I just had no clue what was happening. At that time, I'd never, I'm passionate about the United States. I'm passionate about social studies. But even at that time, my passion hadn't risen to the level of just studying it all the time. So I'd never heard of Al-Qaeda. Never heard of that. And so my initial thought, well, who could do this? Who could, fly planes into the towers, and who could attack the Pentagon? My first thought was obvious choices. Some of America's enemies that had strength, like maybe Russia, maybe China, who knows? And so it was chaos pretty much that day. I remember people calling their families and stuff and just checking in, parents coming to check their kids out, because nobody really knew what was going on. And it was also odd because all the planes, there was no planes flying. They shut all that down. And the big thing is when I left school, I'll never forget this, because like I said, there was that animosity, and you just think, are we ever going to become one country again? But I'll never forget driving and leaving that day, going to the gas station because we was worried that gas was going to be in short supply of things happening in the Middle East. But I'll never forget how many American flags were out. People were standing in line in places that sewed the American flag, and just seeing the flag on everybody's house, seeing it flying over the interstates. It gives me chills right now thinking about it. At that point, I thought, we're divided on a lot of issues, but if we're ever attacked at the center, we're going to come together. And even though with social media and a lot of animosity, it's even driven us, further apart, I still believe that. And I do believe you saw a lot of good come out of 9/11, even though it was a horrific event. You saw people pull together. You saw people helping each other. You saw people putting their own lives on the line for other people. And it made you understand how special of a country we have. We're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but we have an unbelievably great country that continues to grow and develop. And from that point forward, I committed myself to being just an unbelievably great American, knowing as much about our country as we can, and keeping a finish strong attitude. And so that's what I try to do every day. And so for me, 9/11 will never leave. And even today, 20 years later, whenever I watch footage of that, it's still emotional, because people died in those towers, and they knew they were going to die once they couldn't get down. And so I hope this generation today doesn't ever have that moment. And so that's my remembrance of 9/11.
So I'm Josh Hurst. I'm the audio video teacher here at Dade County High School. 9/11 it's one of those childhood / adult memories that you just never forget. I remember I was in preschool when the Challenger exploded, and we watched that live, and that's one of those things that I will just literally never forget. And 9/11 is another one of those things as well. I was in my sophomore year of college. I was actually driving to school. I was going to Dalton State at the time. And I listened to a radio program for shock jocks, basically that their job was to just offend everybody. It was two guys named Lex and Terry. They still actually have a show. They were on Rock 105 in Chattanooga. And on the way to school, I always listened to them in the morning. And I remember they just kind of, they came, they were in the middle of some bit that they were doing, and they just kind of stopped and said, guys, we have to tell you about something that just happened. And they said that a plane had hit the first tower of the World Trade Center. And they're like, we will keep you updated and let you know what's going on. And then they kind of went back into their bit a little bit. They're obviously shaken. And I just remember like continuing to drive to school, and then it was kind of went back to normal for a second. And then as I was getting out of the car, like they kind of went back to, you know, reporting the news. And then went into my class, sat down, was talking to the professor. They had the TV on, and then the second plane hit, and we all sat there watching it live as the second plane hit. And my professor, which at this point I bet he kind of regrets doing this, but he actually made us turn the TV off, and he continued with his lesson that day. But as soon as class was over, like I remember sitting in the Commons in Dalton, eating my chicken fingers because they were the greatest things in the world at Dalton State College, and I just remember sitting there watching TV all day. I mean, I didn't have class anymore, but I didn't want to leave the television set. I wanted to continue watching and consuming like what was going on, and try to find out as much information about as I could. But when I left that day, Rock 105 had stayed on the air on the Lex and Terry show for basically the rest of the day, and they stopped being like shock jocks. Like they became news reporters, and they were, you know, every time that they would have a new bit of information, they would continue to talk about it. They would turn their program over. Instead of being the Lex and Terry show, it would actually become like whatever the CBS News or NBC, whatever was giving a report at that time. But I remember thinking, like, these are people who their job is to entertain people, to make people laugh, but they knew how serious of a situation it was, and so they stopped doing their job. But then I remember, like, afterwards, just everybody, it wasn't just, you know, my household or my neighbor's household or my friend's household, it was literally everyone in the country was glued to a television set for at least 24 hours after the events. I remember watching both towers fall on TV, and then just them talking about the science behind it and how hot the fuel had to be burning in order to melt the structures inside that allowed the building to fall. And just thinking about, you know, those people that were on the plane, like what their last thing that they, you know, that went through their minds was like what happened. And so I remember like our little town, I'm from here, it was just like literally everywhere. You saw nothing but American flags. You saw nothing but patriotism. I mean, there was no kneeling during the national anthem at the time. There was none of that, not standing for the pledge. It was literally everybody just became one, like, just American. There wasn't, we're from the South, or we're, you know, from up north, or everybody was just American. And that's just the way I remember it. It's a terrible memory, but also an amazing memory, because I remember what happened with our country and how we came together as one people instead of, you know, the divisions that we have now. And that's how I remember it.
Hey, my name is Jamie Farney. I'm principal of Dade County High School. When I think of September 11th, I think of the confusion initially. I was a first-year teacher at Stewart Middle School in Douglas County, and had just settled into the lesson that morning. Was teaching 8th grade social studies, and it was a big shock to everybody. I had heard from the teacher across the hall that something was happening. We had cable TV available in our classrooms, and so we turned it on. And at the time, when we first tuned in, the first plane had crashed into the World Trade Center, and but that was it. And they were trying to figure out if it was an accident, what exactly was going on. And so there was lots of partial information and just a ton of questions that people across the country had, and news reporters were trying to do the best they could with it. I remember our school principal sending out an email at the time, and they told us, don't talk about it. We could have kids' parents in the World Trade Center, that kind of thing, and it was a really traumatic time. But I knew that we were witnessing history, so I left the TV on. Probably could have gotten in trouble for that, but I think we were all just trying to figure out what exactly was going on. So as we were watching the broadcast, the second plane hit the World Trade Center, and that's when everybody knew that it was 100%, some sort of a coordinated attack. I remember driving home that day, still in disbelief. Everybody all day just were kind of walking around like zombies as we were trying to figure out what was going on. And I remember going out to the parking lot that afternoon and there not being any air traffic. Douglas County is right outside of Atlanta, and so there's always a plane in the sky overhead, and there was absolutely no noise. I remember going home and sitting down and just watching news broadcast after news broadcast, trying to figure out what was going on. Heard about the Pentagon. My dad is a military guy. My brother is in the Navy, was in the Navy at the time. And, just your thoughts, your head is filled with, okay, so what happens now? Is my brother, who's on a nuclear submarine, is he going to be moved over to the Persian Gulf? Who's really responsible for these things? And I just remember it taking so long to get that information out to folks, and everybody being really impatient. News gets around a lot faster now with the internet and everything. But I just remember it being one of those things that there was so much confusion. But then once we finally wrapped our heads around it, and I'll never forget George Bush visiting Ground Zero, and the way the country came together, that was one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. It's whether you were a Republican or a Democrat, being able to come together as a country and unite around that common cause. That was a special, special moment. So. It was one of the darkest days, but it was also in those days to come, it was one of the proudest times I've ever been. Thought of myself as an American when the entire country kind of banded together, and we were looking for whose tail we needed to kick, and it was a lot, but yeah, it's something that I will certainly never ever forget. And like I said, when you're in something like that, as it's happening, you know that you're a part of history, and we certainly did. But yeah, those are my memories. A lot of head swimming, a lot of trying to figure out what was going on, a lot of confusion, but then that pride, that commitment to one another, that patriotism, all of those things, America really shined after that, and kind of missed those days a little bit. But those are my recollections.